Okay.
Good morning.
Yeah. Sorry. So yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. So this is the last lecture of this series about basics of black hole physics. So today we will investigate some features of black hole dynamics. So let me remind you the homepage setup for these lectures, and in particular, on this web page, you can download the lecture notes, but also the slides, including these slides. So if you go to that page here, if you click on slides and video, so maybe it would be convenient for you to download the slides of the current lecture. You just click on this and you will get the slides. So you can follow on your laptop directly with the PDF if you want. Okay, so let me go back to the presentation. This is the plan for today. First, we will discuss a little bit the formation, the birth of black holes. Then we will derive the so-called first law of black hole dynamics. In a third part, we will derive the second law of black hole dynamics. And then we will realize that all these laws, they can be put together with a zero flow and a third law to obtain the so-called black hole thermodynamics. And then we will see a few applications of this black hole thermodynamics, in particular the second law, especially applications to gravitational wave emissions. Okay, so let's start with this first part about formation of black holes. So the standard astrophysical scenario for forming a black hole is gravitational collapse of a massive star for stellar mass black holes, or of a large cloud of gas in the primordial universe, for instance, for forming supermassive black holes. So this is a space-time diagram of such a collapse. Sorry, the diagram is plotted in terms of, let's say, ingoing Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates, the stated that we've introduced when we discussed the Schwarzschild metric the other day. So in this diagram, this is the surface of the star, the orange line. The yellow part is the interior of the star that is collapsing. And you have some few radial null geodesics, so light rays, if you want, emitted from the star here. And you have the future null light cones here. Here we see clearly the black hole formation because, for instance, if you take this light ray emitted from the center of the star, so suppose the star is transparent to that photon, then it can reach infinity. But this one, which is emitted very nearby, cannot reach infinity. It is trapped in this region, which is the black hole region. And all the subsequent photons emitted in this region are also trapped. And also notice that here you have the surface of a star reaches a sphere of zero radius and then appears curvature singularity here. And the boundary of a black hole region is the event horizon, as we have defined it. So it appears here at the center of the star, in that case, at some point, at some moment. This is now a conformal Carter-Penrose diagram of the same event, the gravitational collapse of a star. So the star now, this is this yellow part. It does not look collapsing, it's look more like expanding in this diagram, but this is an artifact of the coordinate choice. This conformal diagram, they are conformal, it means they respect the angles, especially the null direction are always 45-degree lines in this diagram, but these diagrams do not respect the distance, I mean, they do not respect the metric. So despite it looks expanding, actually the area of a star is decaying in the process. And so the event horizon, being a null hypersurface, appears as a 45-degree line in this diagram. And this is the black hole region, and the singularity, which appears in the center of the star, is represented by this. And we have a piece at the end of Schwarzschild spacetime here, you may recognize a piece of Schwarzschild spacetime with a Sky plus the future null infinity, which appears here, and here we have a future null, the past null infinity here. And so it is interesting to contrast this diagram with the Carter-Penrose diagram of the Schwarzschild spacetime that we have obtained yesterday, actually, which we discussed yesterday. So this is the diagram of a so-called eternal black hole, because this is a black hole which is here forever. For instance, which was created like this, the birth of the universe or something like that. This means that it's not created by gravitational collapse, and in particular, it contains regions which are totally absent of the astrophysical black hole. The astrophysical black hole, it is that one, which is formed by gravitational collapse. So you will notice that the conformal diagram is much simpler. Here we have the entire spacetime in this diagram, okay? And in particular, we don't have this extra region, M3 and M4, in the diagram. We have a part of M2 and we have a part of M1. And in M1, we don't have, in the astrophysical collapse, we don't have this horizon here, which is a white hole horizon. It means that everything can go out from this region. This is a white hole region with respect to Scribus, but nothing can enter into that region. This white hole horizon is totally absent from the astrophysical diagram. And also notice the bifurcation sphere that we discussed yesterday, where these two horizons crosses, is also completely absent. So we don't have here any bifurcation sphere. I mean, we have only. What you have to keep in mind is that although this represents the maximal extension of the Schwarzschild solution, but this is the maximal extension in vacuum, there is no matter, no gravitational collapse in that space-time, so it's a kind of academic solution in some sense, this solution. Okay, so let's move further about the black hole formation. So another way also to form black hole is to get a black hole from smaller ones by merger of two small black holes. They will give birth to a larger black hole. So this has been observed now, as you know, with gravitational wave detectors. Actually, this was even the first source of gravitational wave astronomy. But it has been computed before by means of numerical relativity. Here, this is a head-on collision of two black holes, so it's also a rather academic process, because in nature of a binary black hole merger that we are observing with LIGO and Virgo, actually they are made by orbiting black hole, not head-on collision. But okay, let us assume a head-on collision. And so this is a kind of space-time diagram. This is the event horizon, which is a posteriori reconstruction from the numerical relativity data, because as we have seen on Monday when we gave the definition of a black hole, to know the location of the event horizon, you have to consider Scribus, so future null infinity, because you have to know which geodesic will reach Scribus and which will not reach it. You have to make the distinction between the two, and the boundary between these two kinds of geodesics forms the so-called black hole event horizon. So you have to know all the future of your space-time. So this is not possible at each time in the numerical computation. So it's only after the computation is finished and it has been pushed forward enough in the future that you can retrace back the geodesics and then determine the event horizon. So this is this black surface here. In blue, you have some geodesics which are not part of the event horizon yet, but they will join the event horizon and merge and then remain on it in the future. Okay, this is another view of the same computation. I mean, this head-on collision of two black holes, but now we have equatorial time slices at various times. This is coordinate time, 9M, 13M, and so on and so forth. So at the beginning, we have two separate event horizons, and they are approaching each other. The green dashed line is the locus of some future node generator. I mean, this is node geodesics, the intersection of node geodesics with this constant T slice. And in the future, these node geodesics, like these ones, they will join the full event horizon. In red, we have a so-called apparent horizon. So this is marginally trapped surface. So this is surfaces from which the expansion is 0 or in one null direction and negative in the other null direction, as we have discussed the other day. So it appears here in the numerical simulations. And at some point, we have a common event horizon here, because the two event horizons, the two slices of the, or cross-section, if you want, this is cross-section as we call them, of the event horizon, they merge at this point. And then we have a common cross-section here. But still we have marginally trapped surface, which are not common. Here there appear a marginally trapped surface common to both black holes in some sense. So this ends the fusion. And after a long time, we have a relaxation towards Schwarzschild black hole, because there is no angular momentum in the system. This is head-on collision. So at the end, we have a Schwarzschild black hole here. So for further details, please look at this publication by Cohen, Pfeiffer, and Schill. Okay, this is now an overview from numerical relativity, but this time this is for a binary black hole merger from circular orbits. Initially, so this is orbiting binary black hole, so this is closer to what is observed by LIGO Virgo. And this is a 3D view of a cross-section of the event horizon. Again, this is a posteriori construction from the numerical relativity data, because so the event horizon has been determined once the rule computation has been completed by ray tracing back the null geodesics. And this corresponds to this instant where the two cross sections of each black holes merge to form a common cross sections. You see, it's quite complicated shape in some sense. Okay, so this was just, we could discuss, I mean, for a very long time, the formation of black hole and these binary merger scenarios. But let me now move to more analytical things and what we can say by just computing, I mean, without numerical relativity, what we can say about the dynamics of black holes. So we start by the first law of the black hole dynamics. So we consider actually a simplified version of its first law, which is obtained by considering a small change in a black hole equilibrium. So we imagine that we have a black hole in equilibrium. So thanks to the Mohr theorem, we know that in 4-dimensional general relativity, this black hole has to be a Kerr black hole. So it's described by only two parameters, the mass m and the spin parameter a. And we assume that this black hole is perturbed by either some external body or some gravitational radiation which comes in, or even gravitational waves, which comes from another source. So we have a small perturbation. So there will be some transition regime. Some gravitational wave will be emitted. And at the end, the black hole will relax, will decay to a new equilibrium configuration. And by again, invoking the Mohr theorem, this equilibrium configuration has to be another Kerr black hole. But the parameter will have changed in the process, so the mass will have changed by an amount delta m, and the spin parameter by an amount delta a. So the question is, how can we relate these changes? And the answer is yes. And this relation will give us the first law of black hole dynamics. How do we obtain this change in the mass and spin parameter? Well, as we've seen in lecture 3, I mean yesterday, the lecture about the Kerr black hole, the small m, which appears as a parameter in the Kerr solution, is nothing but the total gravitational mass of a black hole. The small a is related to the total angular momentum by this formula. We also computed yesterday the area of a black hole. I mean, the area of any cross-section of a black hole. It is given in terms of a mass and angular momentum by this formula. And also, we obtained yesterday the angular velocity of a black hole, so-called omega h, which is actually the angular velocity of the null geodesics generating the event horizon, and this velocity being measured with respect to the two natural killing vectors psi and eta, the stationary, the pseudo-stationary killing vector and the axisymmetric killing vector. So it is given by this formula that we obtained yesterday. Actually, yesterday we obtained in terms of A and M, but I'm translating in terms of capital J and capital M. So it is this formula. And also yesterday we obtained the surface gravity of a Kerr black hole, and it's given, or if you want, this is the non-affinity parameter of the null geodesics generating the black hole, the event horizon. The null geodesic being associated to the killing vectors, the null killing vector chi, which is psi plus omega h eta on the horizon. So it is given by this formula. So we have all these formulas. And now let us start from the formula giving the mass. So, and we simply differentiate it. We assume a small variation in the process that occurred between the two equilibrium configurations. So we simply take the differential of this is elementary computation, and we have a differential in J. And then we may reorganize slightly the terms, okay? And if we single out dm from this formula, okay, so we put dm here, then we notice that when we perform the division here by this term, that appears kappa in front of dA. It's nothing but kappa. And also in front of dj, it's nothing but omega h. This is just because of its formulae here. Okay, so we obtain, at the end of the day, a very simple formula relating the small change in the mass of a Kerr black hole due to a perturbation in terms of a small change in area and the small change in the angular momentum. It's given by this very simple, very nice formula. This is the so-called first law of black hole dynamics. Well, we would like maybe to call it first law of black hole thermodynamics. Well, the first term looks okay because it measures the change of mass, and we know that in relativity, mass is the same thing as energy, more or less. So we could call this a change of energy, like a dE. This would be a change of rotational kinetic energy because we have angular velocity times the variation of angular momentum. But what about the first term? I mean, it would looks at that stage. It would look premature to call this first law of black hole thermodynamics because we have no temperature, no entropy yet. So let's keep this first law as it is, and we will come back to it later on. Actually, we will come back after having established the second law, because the second law will provide us with some entropy for the black hole. So how do we establish the second law? Here we are going to do a little bit of computation to establish this law. But we will use tools that we have introduced in the previous lecture. So let me remind you that in the previous lectures, we have seen that the event horizon is ruled by null geodesics. The null geodesics are these green lines here, okay? And the vector tangent to them is a null vector. It is also normal to the horizon, H. It is both tangent and normal because it is null. And we consider a cross-section, which is a space-like two-surface, and in the case of a Kerr spacetime, it is actually a sphere. It has the topology of a sphere. It is a two-sphere with a Riemannian induced metric on it. And we call lambda the affine parameter associated to the null normal, assuming that this null normal is geodesic. I mean, it is a null normal which is chosen such that we have a zero here. In general, we have kappa L, where kappa is a non-infinite parameter, but we have a freedom to rescale L so that kappa is zero, and so that we can choose an affine parameter like this. I'm not saying that kappa, the surface gravity of a pure black hole, is always zero. What I'm saying is that if I don't require L to be related to the two Killing vectors such that L is psi plus omega h eta, if I get rid of this relation, I mean, if I allow myself to rescale L, then I can choose the rescaling such that this is fulfilled. Okay, so this is such a normal. I rescale it so that I'm sure it's a geodesic vector and not only a pre-geodesic vector. And now I'm going to consider the evolution of this cross-section along L. And this is performed by performing the lead dragging of S along L that we have introduced the other day when discussing the expansion. So let me remind you something that we have seen also, that if I consider S as a two surface, so we have a tangent space, which is two-dimensional actually, but here it's drawn as a single line due to some dimensional reduction for the purpose of the drawing. And we have the orthogonal complement. Here, the two-dimensional are respected in this plot. And actually, because the surface is space-like, we have actually the two parts are two-dimensional. Here we can write this decomposition of a tangent space. This is a four-dimensional space, which is divided in this sum of two-dimensional space here and two-dimensional space here. This space is space-like, this one is time-like. And being time-like, the intersection with the null cones, as we have seen the other day, defines two null directions. This is RL, which is tangent to the event horizon, and this is the K, which points in the inward directions towards the inside of a black hole. And we can normalize unambiguously. So we have chosen already L, so that it is a geodesic vector. Now we choose K. We normalize it so that the scalar product with L is -1. Okay, and then we introduce this tensor field. We have defined L and K. We have a space-time metric G. So we introduce this tensor field here. You can see it as a definition. It is a symmetric, as you can see by construction, because G is symmetric, and here we have a symmetric term. And actually, the tensor field is a kind of extension, is a space-time extension to the metric induced by G on the cross-section S. Indeed, if I take two vectors tangent to S, I call them U and V, I take the scalar product with Q of these two vectors. So according to this formula, I have this, but here I will have a term which is zero, because by definition, L is normal to the horizon. So in particular, it's normal to any vector of S tangent to S. So it is zero. And similarly, this term is zero because V is tangent to S. So at the end, I have that the scalar product obtained by Q is the same as the scalar product obtained by G. So I may say that Q is nothing, when I restrict it to S, is nothing but the metric induced by G on S. But I can see, but I'm considering in all the remaining that this is really a space-time tensor field, this Q, not only the two metric on S, but it's a more general thing. And in particular, if I raise the first index with the metric, so the G, when I raise the index, will give me delta, and here I will have vector L, and here I will have vector K, okay? Then this is a type 1-1 tensor field. So we may consider it at each point as being an endomorphism of the tangent space. And this endomorphism is nothing but the orthogonal projector onto the surface. Indeed, you can check that if you apply this to vector which is already tangent, these terms will give 0. So thanks to the delta, we will get the identity. And if we apply it to L, we will get 0 automatically. This is quite trivial because we have chosen our scalar product with k to be -1. This is why we're using this property here. So it is the orthogonal projector, this Q. So now, the other day, I mean on Monday, we have defined the expansion along the null normal of the surface S. This is the theta L. But now we are going to define something more general. So the expansion was a scalar at each point. Now we are going to define a tensor of valence 2 at each point, actually a symmetric bilinear tensor at each point that we will call the deformation rate tensor of the surface. It will measure the evolution of a metric cube, induced metric, along the null normal. So by definition, we could do the same construction as the other day. I mean, to have a lead drag of a surface by a small parameter epsilon along L, and compare the metric on that surface with the metric on the original surface. In doing so, actually, mathematically speaking, we are not doing nothing but computing the lead derivative of the tensor field Q along L. So this is the variation of the metric, induced metric, when you push forwards to a future along the null direction defined by L. And we project back this to the two surface to have a tensor field which is tangent to the two surface. So in terms of component, this is this. We take the lead derivative of the two metric and we project on the two surface. And there is a factor 1/2 for convenience. We may, so this is really the evolution operator of the two metric. This is why we call it the deformation rate tensor, because it measures the evolution of the induced metric of a two surface. And we can express it in terms of covariant derivative of L by using the standard formula which expresses the lead derivative of a tensor field of valence 2 in terms of covariant derivative of space-time, the nabla. So it is a standard formula, and the standard formula actually you can simplify it because of this projector here, which may get rid of this term, for instance, and we get only this term here. Okay, so this is quite simple formula giving the theta. Now, as I said just before, in lecture 1, we define the expansion along L as the relative variation of the area of the cross-section. So in adapted coordinates, the area element is given by this. So this is two coordinates, y1, y2, that we may introduce on the two surface, S. And Q is then the determinant of the metric, induced metric Q of the component. This is the determinant of the component with respect to coordinates y1, y2. And then a simple formula because of this, I mean, is simply that the expansion is nothing but the logarithmic derivative of the determinant, the square root of the determinant, the area element along L. And there is a very standard formula. It's just a formula which is valid for any matrix. Actually, if you take the matrix of the component with respect to these coordinates, of the component of a metric Q, you take the inverse matrix, and the variation of the determinant is related to the variation of the matrix itself by means of this formula for any derivative operator. Here I've written for a lead derivative, but it's valid for any kind of derivative operator, namely an operator which obeys the Leibniz rule. So we have this well-known formula, and then we could actually, when I wrote AB here, I'm considering only indices which varies between 1 and 2. This is the surface indices, but we may extend this, we can see, to the space-time indices, and then we can let appear here theta, because theta is more or less the derivative, lead derivative of Q along L. So we get this formula. And so it means that this is the theta L is nothing but the trace of capital theta, the deformation tensor taken by the metric G. Okay, so this is another interpretation of this expansion. The scalar expansion is the trace of a deformation tensor. And so by removing the trace, we can get a traceless object that we call the shear tensor. We denote it by sigma. So we define the shear tensor as being the deformation tensor minus its trace. So in terms of component, it's given by this formula here. Okay. So we have introduced all the objects that we needed to establish the second law. And we need another, now to move on, we need to establish a famous identity, which is very useful in general relativity. This is the so-called Raychaud-Dury equation, and here we will focus on the null version of this equation. So what is the Raychaud-Dury equation? Well, this is an identity that we're going to derive from a geometric identity, which is the Ricci identity, which can be seen as the definition of a Riemann tensor. The Riemann curvature tensor in space-time can be seen as an object which tells how the Levi-Civita connection, the nabla derivative, the covariant derivative commutes. So if I take a vector L, any vector, of course we will apply this to the null normal to the event horizon, but this identity is valid for any vector in space-time. If I take two successive covariant derivatives of this vector and I commute, I permute, I switch the indices, so this is the commutator if you want, then in general, this commutator is not zero for a vector, and it is zero only if the space-time is flat. If it is not flat, then this defines the curvature. So this is the so-called Ricci identity. So I apply it to my vector L, my non-normal to event horizon. And if I contract this identity over the indices alpha and gamma, okay, so now I call this contraction actually sigma here, this common index. Then I get, I use this standard formula to let appear the Ricci tensor, because this is this contraction of the Riemann tensor, the Ricci tensor, okay. So naturally appears the Ricci tensor in the right-hand side. So I have a Ricci contracted with L, okay. Please don't hesitate to interrupt me at any point if you have any question, a doubt, or whatever. Sorry. Then we get this identity here, which is a vector identity. I have an index which is 3 here, beta. More precisely, it is a covector identity. And I contract it with L, the vector, null vector itself. So now I have a contraction. So I call mu the common index for contraction. And so I have this term here. I have this term, which is this contraction, and I have this contraction here. Now I may use some property of vector L. First of all, if you take the first term here, thanks to the Leibniz rule, you can write it like this. Okay, this is the nabla mu of this minus this, and I get this, okay. And this term, this is interesting because this term is zero because we assume from the very beginning that L is a geodesic vector, okay? It was rescaled so that this is identically zero. So we end up with this formula simply, okay? Now we will let appear the deformation tensor. So we will replace these terms actually by terms involving the deformation tensor. We have seen that the deformation tensor of the surface is related to the covariant derivative of L via this formula, where this was this projector operator. So we can write, if we expand this, I mean, if we plug this into this, we expand, and we get a relation which is an expression of a covariant derivative of L in terms of a deformation tensor. And then here you have a derivative of L, which is contracted with K. And here you have other terms. Okay. Then if I use a few things, I mean, if I take the trace of this, I get the divergence of L is related to the trace of theta, which is theta L, and all the other terms are zero. You have some contraction by construction, you can check everything goes to zero. So I have that the divergence of L is exactly theta. And this term here that I had in my equation, then when I replace, sorry, excuse me. When I replace the covariant derivative of L with this expression, I get actually this term. All the other terms vanishes because of its identity here. So now this term, I can let appear the shear tensor. So I replace theta by the shear part and the trace part. Okay. Each of this. So I have a square of a shear here, and I have at the end, because I have this term, and this is a two-dimensional metric here. So I have simply this term. So I get this simple expression. And so if I go, if I look, I was starting from that equation. I mean, I get this equation. So now I'm arriving this equation here, which is the null Raychaud-Durée equation. Well, not yet, because I will replace the Ricci with the energy momentum tensor in the space-time thanks to Einstein's equations. If I contract Einstein's equations twice with L, then I get this is zero because L is a null vector. So I can replace this R, L mu by 8 pi times the T nu, nu, L nu, L nu. This derivative, this is a scalar, theta L. So this derivative along L is nothing but the derivative along with respect to the affine parameter lambda, which is associated to L. So we may rewrite this as a derivative. If we consider this variation along the null generator, this is nothing but the derivative with respect to the affine parameter. And so this is the final form of a new Raychaud-Durée equation. It gives the variation towards the future because we assume that well, the affine parameter is increasing to the future. So along a null geodesic of the event horizon, this rules the evolution of the expansion. And the right-hand side is this quite simple formula involving the expansion itself squared, the square of a shear tensor, and this energy momentum part here. Okay. Now we are going to assume some energy condition, and the natural energy condition in this setting is the so-called null energy condition. So this null energy condition is saying that for a reasonable matter, this contraction of the energy momentum tensor with the null vector is positive, is non-negative. Non-negative. It means it is either positive or zero. And we call it null energy condition, and we have to keep in mind this is a very mild condition. It's violated only for very exotic things. First of all, we may notice that it is trivially satisfied in vacuum. So if we consider a black hole, and we consider vacuum in the event horizon, because here we are considering the evolution of the event horizon. So even if there is matter around the black hole, for instance, an accretion disk, it could be that close to the event horizon, there is no matter at all. So we are in vacuum. So then this identity is trivially satisfied. It is satisfied, as I said, for many types of matter, and also it is satisfied by electromagnetic field. If we consider the energy momentum tensor of the electromagnetic field, so as you may know, it's formed from the Faraday tensor, the electromagnetic field tensor F, which is a two form. It's formed by this identity here. So if I contract with L, I get that this term here is 0 because L is a null vector. So I get only this square. This is a square. This is square of the vector capital E. And this vector, it would be, if L would be time-like, this would be a real electric field. So this is why it's denoted by here. But whatever it is, what is interesting is that this product is necessarily positive because this vector is orthogonal to L. You can see that by construction, if we define this vector like this, if we take we contract it with L, we get this. Because F is antisymmetric, this is the electromagnetic field 2 form, so it is antisymmetric, we get automatically 0. And this means that this vector E is orthogonal to L. Now you can convince yourself that a vector that is orthogonal to a null vector is necessarily space-like or null. Its scalar product has to be positive. It means no time-like vector can be orthogonal to a null vector. Okay, so this scalar product is positive. So this means that the null energy condition is satisfied. I mean, this term is positive. Okay, and also this condition by continuity is implied by the weak energy condition. This is a quite famous energy condition. It says that if you take a time-like vector U, this contraction of U with energy momentum tensor is non-negative. And in particular, if U is a unit time-like vector, then it will represent the four velocity of an observer. Then this quantity is nothing but the energy density of matter measured by that observer. So this is a physical quantity. And so the weak energy condition is saying nothing but that the energy density of matter measured by any observer must be non-negative. So this is fulfilled by all ordinary matters, I mean, all the matter that we know. It's possibly related by quantum fluctuations, for instance, in the Casimir effect or things like this, but for reasonable matter, it is non-negative. So it's if matter obey this, then necessarily it will obey the null energy condition by kind of continuity when you go to time-like to null actually. So this is a very mild energy condition. So we ask for it, we demand for it. And now we get the theorem. If we assume these conditions, this is the so-called positive expansion theorem. So the theorem is as follows. On a black hole, event horizon H, the expansion along any future directed non-normal is everywhere positive or 0. So we got the theta L must be positive or 0. So how do we prove this? So as I said before, if L is only because here we're assuming non-normal. So if it is with kappa non-zero, we can rescale it to get a L that we want, for which we derive the null Réchaud-Durée equation. And because of this rescaling, we have to keep alpha positive because we want to keep the future directed direction. So alpha is to be positive. So if alpha is positive, when we have a rescaling, the expansion rescale with alpha. So if one is positive, the other one is positive as well. So now we can consider the null Réchaud-Durée equation that we have just established. And thanks to the null energy condition, this term here is negative by assumption, I mean, for the matter. And this term with the minus sign is negative as well. This is very easy to establish because this is symmetric, as we have noticed. The shear tensor, this is a symmetric matrix, two-dimensional matrix in terms of components. And this space in which it lives is equipped with a positive definite metric, Q. And then this means we have a symmetric matrix. It means that it can be diagonalized in a basis which is orthonormal with respect to Q. This is a well-known property of symmetric matrices. So assume that when we diagonalize it, we have a matrix like this. It has to be like this because it has to be traceless. The shear is the traceless part of the deformation tensor. So it has to be traceless, so it has to be, the two eigenvalues have to be opposite. So this means that when I take the square, I take the inverse matrix, I get automatically 2 sigma square. No, sorry, this is not the inverse matrix. This is the matrix of this is raised by the metric Q. So I get this square here, and so it has to be positive. So I have a minus sign, it has to be negative, and this is clearly negative. Okay, so what we get from the Moll-Raychaud-Durée equation and this Moll energy condition is that the derivative of theta with respect to lambda has to be less than this negative quantity here. So now we want to prove that theta is positive. So we see that the derivative is always negative or 0. So now assume that we want to prove that it is positive, so we will assume the opposite and obtain a contradiction. So assume that it is negative at some point on the event horizon. We call this value theta 0 at some point P on the event horizon. Then we choose an affine parameter lambda, such that lambda is 0 at that point, just for simplicity. Because the derivative is negative, then for all subsequent value of theta, of lambda, sorry, theta has to be smaller than function theta bar, and the theta bar obeys this equation where you have equality here. Okay, this follows from this. And here, if I have equality, I'm introducing this function theta bar because this is a differential equation that I can solve. So the initial condition here would be that this is this negative value, and the solution with that initial condition, this is a first order differential equation. It has a unique solution, and the unique solution is given by this expression here. Okay. And then we see that this expression goes to diverge to minus infinity because theta naught is negative. When lambda goes to that value, which is strictly positive. So lambda equals 0 was the initial condition. And after a while, when I reach a finite value of lambda, I get that theta bar is diverging. So because the real theta is always smaller than theta bar, it has to diverge as well for value possibly smaller than this limiting value. So we will get, if we assume that it is negative at some point, then we will get that it is necessarily diverging in the future of this point. Okay. So this is nothing pathological with this, actually, that the theta is diverging. It's not the sign that we have a singularity in spacetime. We have simply a focusing point. A point where the expansions are diverging is a point where the null geodesics will merge. So it's a kind of focusing point. But this enters in contradiction with the Penrose theorem that we have seen at the end of lecture 1. The Penrose theorem, which is demonstrated in the lecture notes, for instance, and also, of course, in Penrose original papers, there must be only one null geodesic generator for each point on the event horizon, except in exceptional points where the null geodesic generator enters the event horizon, as we have seen in these numerical relativity computations of binary black hole mergers. But this cannot be the case here. We can exclude these exceptional points because this occurs for a point, sorry, which is in the future of our null geodesics, which was already, sorry, which was already on the event horizon. So we can exclude this, and we cannot have a focusing point because at each point there must be only one null geodesic. So we arrive at a contradiction that means that our initial assumptions cannot hold, and theta cannot be negative at some point on the event horizon. So it has to be positive everywhere. So let's establish this positive expansion theorem. Theta is always positive on the event horizon. And now, thanks to this, we can establish the second law of black hole thermodynamics. It was actually first established by Stephen Hawking in 1979. So there are some assumptions, additional assumptions, but these assumptions are also quite mild. They regard the global causality structure of the space-time, and we assume that the space-time is globally hyperbolic, which means that we can predict the future from an initial space-like hypersurface. We put some initial data in that hypersurface, and we can compute everything in the future of the space-time. This is called global hyperbolicity. It means that the Cauchy problem is well formulated, and in particular, we don't have a Cauchy horizon. The Cauchy horizon, which be a limitation for predictions to the future in the space. And we don't have any naked singularity, which will also be a limitation of predictability, because everything comes out from naked singularity, and this would spoil then the prediction, things that you can compute for the future of space-time. So assume this condition, which is quite natural, quite general. Then we can consider a foliation of a region V, which is the region close to the event horizon, actually, by a family of space-like hypersurface with a parameter T, which is increasing towards the future. So this is space-like. This is called 3+1 decomposition of space-time, or 3+1 slicing or foliation of space-time. And each hypersurface is a Cauchy hypersurface. It means you can give initial data on that hypersurface, and thanks to Einstein equations, compute the future of the hypersurface, and this defines the whole space-time. Then this hypersurface, they intersect, each of them intersects the event horizon in a cross-section, by definition of a cross-section. Because they are space-like, they are nowhere tangent to the null generator. So again, these black lines here are the null geodesic generator of the event horizon. So, but they have to be transverse to the hypersurface sigma t, because sigma t is space-like, cannot contain any null direction. So these ST, these cross-sections, they are space-like, they are really cross-sections as we define them. Of the event horizon. So we may call A of T the area of a cross-section ST. And then what Hawking theorem is saying is that the evolution of, if you move forward in time with T, then this area can only either stay constant or increase. It means its derivative with respect to T has to be non-negative. So this is the second law. And now we're going to prove it, thanks to all the tools that we have obtained up to now. So the proof is like this. So we take the non-normal L, compatible with the foliation. It means that it is such that the evolution of T with respect to L is 1. Means that we can choose T as being a parameter along L, associated to L. And so we have the situation, we have here the event horizon. So take a generic case here when there is no new geodesic entering into the horizon, some geodesics are entering here. Then if there is no geodesic entering the horizon between ST here and the neighboring surface ST plus delta T, then we have this ST plus delta T is deduced from ST by Lie dragging of the ST along L, because at each point here we have an antecedent point here. Okay. So then this variation of the area is given by definition of the expansion the expansion measures the variation of the area. So if we integrate it on the whole surface, we get the variation of the area itself. And the equality will hold here only, in this case, it will be an exact equality because I have no null geodesics. But if I have new geodesics, like in this case here, I have new geodesics entering into the horizon, then it will be even larger because I will have more larger area from the area I started from. Okay, because I have more things entering here. So it's either equal in general when I don't have a merger of two black holes, I have strict equality, or if I have a merger, it's even superior. Okay. So we have seen, we have established, thanks to the Einstein equation and the null energy condition, we have established the positivity of theta L. So if theta L is positive, then it follows that this guy must be positive. So this establish the second law. I mean that the variation, the area can only increase towards the future. Well, why is it called the second law? Of course, it's by analogy at this point, where the second law of thermodynamics, because the second law of thermodynamics tells you that the entropy of an isolated system can only increase towards the future. So it's kind of irreversibility of the area. This was quite a basic discovery in the history of black hole physics, this second law. So it leads us to naturally to black hole thermodynamics. Because if we go back now to the first law that we have obtained is this formula. And now we see that this A behaves like a kind of entropy because it can always increase towards the future thanks to the second law. So we may identify it to the entropy. So we may say that the entropy of a black hole is proportional with some proportionality factor, which we don't know yet, to the area. And then naturally, the term in front, if we want to call this a third law, really, a first law, sorry, has to be temperature. So we say that this term, again, we have to introduce some proportionality factor. This is 1 over alpha, so that the product of the two alpha disappears, and we have a TdS term, okay, like in the first law of thermodynamics. But we have still to determine alpha. Okay. To gain some insight about this, that we are not doing something crazy, because after all, we have simply a quantity which is increasing towards the future, and maybe you may find that calling this an entropy is quite an abuse, because many things could increase. After all, it means simply that it has a positive derivative with respect to time, and not everything that has a positive derivative with respect to time is called an entropy in physics. Okay, so maybe it's a kind of abuse, but to strengthen this, let's consider this kappa. We will see now, thanks to the zeroth law, that it behaves really like a temperature. In particular, it is constant in equilibrium, like the temperature. Why is it so? Because we found this formula. Actually, it was done in the Sage math notebook. We didn't do together the computation, but you can redo it yourself. We found this formula for kappa. And kappa, a priori, this is the non-affinity parameter of a null geodesic generator L, chi as we called it. And it could depend. It has to be independent of the time because of the time symmetry of the Kerr solution, but it could depend on theta a priori. There is no reason why it should not depend on theta. It could vary from one geodesic to the other on the event horizon. And it turns out that it does not depend on theta. It depends only on the two constant parameters of the Kerr solution. Okay, so it is constant like the temperature for a thermodynamic system in equilibrium. So this is why this is called the zeroth law of black hole mechanics or dynamics. And actually, this result can be extended to any Killing horizon. So, of course, the event horizon of a Kerr black hole is a specific case of a Killing horizon. This results also leaking the horizon. This is shown explicitly in this section of the lecture note if you want to have a look. Kappa is constant on any Killing horizon. But for this, again, you have to assume some energy condition, which is a very mild energy condition. This is called the so-called null-dominant energy condition. That this vector here is future-directed null or time-like for any future-directed null vector. It means the vector remains causal. In particular, this null-dominant energy condition implies the null energy condition that we use for the second law. And any reasonable type of matter like electromagnetism obeys this null energy condition. Okay. Now we have a third law as well, which again gives some hints to identify kappa to the temperature for a Kerr black hole. So kappa was given by this, and we notice for extremal Kerr black hole, it means when A is equal to M, kappa vanishes identically. So kappa is 0. And this extremal Kerr black hole, we may ask the question, can we form them in the universe by accreting matter onto sub-extremal Kerr black hole? I mean, a Kerr black hole with A strictly lower than M. And the answer is no. There is a theorem which is called the third law. It was proved rigorously by Werner Israel in 1986. And the theorem says that no continuous process in which the energy momentum tensor of accreted matter remains bounded and satisfies the weak energy condition in the neighborhood of the apparent horizon can reduce the surface gravity kappa of a black hole to 0 within a finite advanced time v. This is this time that we introduce this parameter along the null ingoing geodesics, which can serve as well as time along time parameter along the event horizon, or we can use, if you prefer, TTL, the Kerr time that we have introduced before, which is nothing but V is nothing but TTL plus R. So since R is constant, so it's the same thing on the Kerr horizon. So it means you cannot physically, this means that you cannot spin up a Kerr black hole to reach extremality by a finite amount of matter and a finite time, okay, within a finite time. So this is a reminiscent of one version of the third law of thermodynamics, which says that by no physical process you can reach zero temperature for a given thermodynamic system. And there is another version of the third law which says that the entropy must be zero at zero temperature, but this version does not hold for black hole mechanics, because for this extremal black hole, the temperature is 0 if you identify kappa to the temperature, but the entropy is not 0 because the entropy is proportional to the area, as we've seen, and the area of an extremal black hole is nowhere 0. If you look at the area formula, here. Okay, sorry, I have to be back. Yes, this is the area of a black hole. So in the extremal case, this term vanishes. So the area is 8 pi m square for an extremal black hole. It is not 0. Okay. So this means that this version of the third law of thermodynamics does not hold for the black hole. I mean, the version in which the entropy is 0 at 0 temperature. Here we're using the other version of the third law, namely that it's not possible by any reasonable physical process, to reach 0 temperature starting from a non-zero one. Okay, so we have this third law. Okay, so now we have established actually, well, the third law we didn't establish, we relied on this theorem proved by Israel. We have our four law of thermodynamics. Now, let me recap. So the zeroth law was saying that the surface gravity of a black hole in equilibrium is constant. The first law is that two nearby black hole equilibrium configuration obey the variation of the parameters obey this relation, that dm is proportional to dA and dj. And the second law is that the area of cross-section of the black hole event horizon can only increase toward the future. And the third law is that non-zero surface gravity of a black hole in equilibrium cannot be reduced to zero by accretion of matter, or any physical process, let's say. Okay. And just for the historical note here, we may notice that these four laws have been formulated first when James Bardeen met with Brandon Carter and Stephen Hawking in the very famous summer school, which was held in Les Houches in the French Alps in 1972. So they were doing very interesting lectures at that school, but also they were discussing among themselves, and they ended up with this paper, and they acknowledged that all these discussions were performed during that school, and they formulated these four laws. Simply for the third law, they demonstrated the zeroth, the first and the second law in that paper, and for the third, they put forward some arguments in favor of it, but it was not a rigorous demonstration. The rigorous demonstration was achieved only in 1986 by Israel. Okay. Now, to make the complete link with thermodynamics, actually we have to set this constant alpha that was determined before, relating the area to the entropy. And this is done thanks to the discovery of Hawking radiation by Hawking in 1955. I'm not going to detail Hawking radiation here, but in doing Hawking radiation, which is a quantum process in the vicinity of a black hole event horizon, you have a black body radiation at that temperature, so H bar enters into the game because it's a quantum process, and this relates rigorously the temperature to the surface gravity, and this sets the coefficient alpha. And as a consequence of this, you get that the entropy has to be related to the area by this relation, where one let appear the Planck length. So this is the so-called Bekenstein-Hawking entropy relation, which was actually almost obtained by Bekenstein just before the discovery of Hawking radiation. And if we put some numbers in this formula, remember that for first black hole we found that the surface gravity kappa was 1/4m, so and the area was 16 pi m squared. So we get that the temperature is very small. If we take a solar mass black hole, we have only 6×10⁻⁸ Kelvin. So this is very cold object in that sense. But the entropy is huge. The entropy in units of the Boltzmann constant is of the order 10 to 77. It's a huge entropy in the black holes. Okay, so let's finish the black hole thermodynamics. Now we're going to apply it to two things. First, to the Penrose process, to set an upper bound extracted on the energy extracted via Penrose process. Yesterday, we have derived the Penrose process. I mean, we have seen that we can extract energy from a rotating Kerr black hole by splitting particles in the ergo region of a black hole. So suppose we are going to consider the energy gain. So suppose this process where we start from a black hole with initial mass mi, I is for initial, and angular momentum parameter ai. And we are going to extract energy until we reach a final state where the black hole is no longer rotating. We have exhausted all the rotational energy of a black hole via the Penrose process, assume this is an assumption. So we end up with a Schwarzschild black hole. So in the Schwarzschild black hole, it's no longer possible to apply the Penrose process because the ergosphere coincides with the event horizon. It means it's not possible to go outside the black hole to escape from the Ergo region because the boundary of the Ergo region coincides with the event horizon. So in other words, the Ergo region is entirely located inside the black hole, for Schwarzschild black hole. So this is the end of the energy extraction. So we call the mass of a Schwarzschild black hole MF. And so the total energy gain will be the initial mass minus the final mass. And the second law tells you that the area of a final black hole must be larger than the area of the initial black hole. So if you translate the area in terms of m and a parameter, for Schwarzschild black hole, this was 16 pi m squared. So if we divide by 8 pi, we get 2m squared. And here there was an 8 pi factor, so we divided by 8 pi, and we get this formula for the area of the initial black hole. And if we want to maximize this energy gain via the Penrose process, we have to have this minimal, I mean, to end up with a Schwarzschild black hole, a static black hole of mass as low as possible. So to get this minimal, we have to minimize this term here and it's possible to have it minimal if it is 0, and namely if A is equal to M, and A being equal to M means we are dealing with extremal Kerr black hole at the beginning. Okay, then we get this, so this is 0, so we get this. It means that the final mass has to be larger than this. So the upper bound that we get in this process for the energy gain for the Penrose process is given by this formula then, and this is roughly 1/3 of the initial mass. So it means starting from an extremal black hole, you can extract and reducing a maximally rotating Kerr black hole, the extremal Kerr black hole, A equal M. If we reduce it to a Schwarzschild black hole, then we will extract 1/3 of the total mass initially, which is quite a lot actually. But this is an upper bound on the Penrose process. Maybe more interestingly, because this is quite academic, what I've said, we can set also upper bounds on the gravitational radiation from a binary black hole merger. And this formula has been obtained very early by Hawking himself. So suppose we have two black holes in the initial stage, two Kerr black holes when they are far apart. It's a good approximation to treat each of the black holes as being a Kerr black hole. So they have a parameter M and A, M1, A1, and M2, A2. And at the final stage, after so they merge, they emit a bunch of gravitational waves. If this is a highly dynamical configuration, but if you wait sufficiently longer, then at the end, you end up, thanks to the uniqueness theorem or no-air theorem, to a single Kerr black hole in equilibrium. So parameter M3A3. And the total amount of energy which is taken away by the gravitational wave, this is the only way you can take out energy in that process, because we assume the black hole to be completely isolated, there is no accretion disk, nothing. So it's for emission of gravitational waves. So this is the initial mass, the sum of the two initial mass minus the final mass. This is the energy taken out by the gravitational wave. So we may define the efficiency of the gravitational radiation as being that energy divided by the initial energy, M1 plus M2. Okay. Now, the second law tells you that the area of a finite black hole must be larger than the sum of the area of the two initial black holes. So, in terms of, if you replace now the area by its expression in terms of the mass and the angular momentum, it gives you this expression, this inequality. Now, this equality, you want to maximize, let's say we want to maximize the efficiency in the gravitational radiation. So this efficiency will be maximum if M3 here is minimal. So to have M3 minimal, okay, we see that we have to have A1 to minimize this. A1 is to be minus A1 has to be M1, sorry, and so that to cancel this term, and we want also to cancel that term. So we assume this, we have this, and then also to have M3 minimal, we have to actually cancel A3 here. So we'll get that 2m3 squared is larger than m1 squared plus m2 squared, which implies this. And then this implies this upper bound on the energy gain in gravitational waves. Okay. So this upper bound depends on the mass of the two initial black holes, but the maximum of this gravitational wave efficiency is achieved when the two masses, if you study this function, you will see that the maximum is achieved when the two masses are equal, and this maximum is nothing but 1/2. So we get this absolute upper bound on the energy radiated away by a gravitational wave in the binary merger black hole. This could be at most 1/2 of the mass of the two black holes, two initial black holes. This is the so-called Hawking upper bound. Now we may ask the question, what happens for a realistic binary black hole merger? I mean, from two initially non-spinning equal mass black hole, not extremal Kerr black hole. So we assume that we have initially two non-spinning, two Schwarzschild black holes, and equal mass, let's say. Then, if we apply the second law, we get this, that this is the area of the final black hole is to be larger than the sum of the two areas. So it is this. And again, we get this is maximal if M3 is minimal. So we can reach the M3 minimal if A3 is 0 in that identity. So we get this inequality. Hence, we get this upper bound here, that the efficiency is at most 1/3, let's say, 0.29. This is very high, actually. And in practice, it is not as high as it is, as this value. And in practice, I mean, this is valid for any binary black hole merger from two Schwarzschild black hole equal mass, but it can be add-on, it can be whatever configuration. But if we consider now inspiraling binary black hole, I mean, binary black hole on circular orbit initially, then the gravitational wave efficiency is much lower. This efficiency has been computed from numerical relativity. For instance, in that paper, if you take two Schwarzschild black holes of equal mass on circular orbit and you let them merge, then you get a final black hole, which is a Kerr black hole, with the spin per meter, quite a rapidly rotating Kerr black hole, 0.68 in terms of the relative spin. And the efficiency, I mean, the energy taken away in the gravitational wave radiation is 0.048. It's much lower than that value, but not very low as well. I mean, it's an important fraction of the initial mass. Okay, so this concludes this lecture. This was a simple application of the second law of thermodynamics. And so this concludes what we can say about the dynamics of black holes in simple terms, I mean, by doing some simple analysis. Okay, so I end on this, and of course, I am ready to answer any question.
Thanks, Eric. So now it's open for question and answer, if any of you. So, yeah, Samik, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
If you a little bit louder, it will be better, maybe.
Okay, just one second. Yes, now is it fine?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sir, can you go to slide number 33?
This one?
I'm not able to, yes. So, sir, I mean, I did not understand this question, actually. What does it mean? I mean, from the, surface gravity term, it is quite clear, but what do you mean by this question? If you could clarify more.
Yes, we may ask the question, because this was in the way to establish the third law. If you have in mind the third law of thermodynamics, it says that you cannot reach zero temperature. I mean, if you take a physical system at finite temperature, you cannot cool it down to exactly zero. It's not possible. This is the content of the third law of thermodynamics. And so we may ask the same question for black hole. Take a black hole with a non-zero temperature, so it means kappa being non-zero surface gravity. And the question is, can I, by some physical process, can I bring this black hole to a zero surface gravity, to kappa equals zero? So this is the question. And by physical process, I mean typically accretion of matter. This is the natural way to make a black hole evolve. Another way more dramatic would be a merger with another black hole or with a neutron star or something like this. So yeah.
Yes, sir.
So this is a reasonable question because a priori you may say, oh yes, if I accrete matter, I will change both A and M. So maybe I can change A and M of the black hole in such a way that at the end of the process, I have A equal to M. A priori, this seems a reasonable question, and the answer is no. You cannot do this. So this is a reminiscent of third law of ordinary thermodynamics.
Sir, I mean, here is the point that in theory of accretion dynamics, we can actually do I mean, if for a stellar mass black hole, if we take and study the accretion, we can actually take this A value up to 0.99. So,
yes, 0.99 you can. You can, but you cannot go to 1.
Okay. That's the thing. Okay, fine. And sir, one more thing about slide number 8 and 9. Can you open that slide number 9?
9, yes. Is this one?
Yes. So here actually you have shown at different, I mean, this merging phenomenon, right? I mean, of two black holes. So my question is, if, I mean, we assume that there are matters surrounded by this black hole, I mean, which is the accretion is happening and separately in two different black holes, right? So what is the dynamics of that accretion disk of this final merged black hole?
Okay, this type of question is starting to be answered by current numerical computations, and nowadays people doing numerical relativity are considering also accretion disks around black holes. So one should look at the most recent result in this. I don't have them in mind, but in doing the numerical computation, people are computing also the flux emitted by this matter on the black hole, and so to see if we can have an electromagnetic counterpart of its binary black hole merger, because otherwise there is no electromagnetic counterpart if there is no matter around the black holes.
Yes.
So I don't know exactly what is your question, but
no, I mean just like what will be the change of the structure of this accretion disk and all these things. So
yes, probably yes. In this process, you have huge tidal forces. So that probably the accretion disks are completely disrupted.
Okay.
But I don't have in mind the final results in this. One should look at the recent literature, but for sure, people are computing this today. I mean, this evolution of accretion disks in binary merged black.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll look forward to it. Okay.
So there is one question in the chat box by Daniel Rajan. Is the diagram given in the slide 8 is generated using StigMath, the software?
No, this one is generated using numerical relativity data. So SageMath, for the time being, can deal only with analytic things. I mean, it's a computer algebra system. We plan to extend SageMath so that it can compute geodesics in numerically in space-time, numerical space-time, in space-time which originates from numerical relativity. So you give basically the metric tensor on a grid, discrete points, and we plan to do the computation of geodesics in this grid setting, but it is not implemented yet. What is implemented in SageMath at the moment is the computation of geodesics, numerical computation by various algorithms of geodesics in any space-time, but the space-time you have to give a metric by some analytic formula, an explicit formula, like you give a Kerr metric, for instance, or another metric that you want to study. Then SageMath can compute for you the geodesics. But if the metric is not known with some analytic formula, but only known on a grid, at the moment, SageMath cannot compute the geodesic. You have to use another tool like Giotto, for instance, or here I don't know what ray tracing code they were using, but it was another one.
So there is Sumit has a question. Sumit, please go ahead. You can ask.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Sir, my question is regarding these energy conditions. Like you showed that the second law basically uses the null energy condition, whereas the zeroth law uses the null dominant energy condition, and the third law also uses different energy conditions. So the question is like, I mean, is there any way to choose like which physical scenario will use which energy condition? Like, is it like a priori defined? Like, I mean, which energy condition to use in what proof to? I mean, in whatever proof we have for our problem.
Well, yes, we have to keep in mind when we state a theorem in general relativity, we have to keep in mind which energy condition is necessary for the theorem to hold, of course. But let me stress again that this energy condition that I've mentioned, basically today we have used three of them: the null energy condition, the weak energy condition, and the dominant energy condition. These three energy conditions are very mild, actually. All ordinary matter, again, obeys these conditions. I mean, it's very difficult to find a model. So you can have some theoretical model of matter, but all matter that we know, for instance, neutron star matter, very dense matter, nuclear matter, every kind of matter that we know do obey these energy conditions. So to violate them, you have to get to some quite very exotic things. So we may assume, just roughly speaking, that they are always true in some sense, these conditions. But of course, you can find counterexample if you have exotic things like I was mentioning vacuum fluctuations, for instance, things like this, which violates this condition, that quantum fluctuations of vacuum.
Like for quantum scenarios and all, we have to change these energy conditions, or we have to use some modified energy conditions in that sense.
Yes,
right?
Yes. In quantum electrodynamics, you have this vacuum fluctuation, which may violate this energy condition. But what a process that we think is active in astrophysics, for instance, in astrophysical conditions, we don't expect. But of course, we may get surprised some days. I mean, if someday we see a black hole, by some means, a black hole event horizon which is decaying, well, this could be the sign that something is wrong with these assumptions, of course. But
so these energy conditions are basically based upon some physical arguments, like which are normally satisfied in most of the scenarios, right?
Yes, for instance, this weak energy condition is telling you that you, as an observer, if you're a physical observer, I mean, you have a time like 4 velocity, then you will always measure a positive energy density. And this is the case. I mean, if you measure the energy density of whatever, ordinary matter, whatever, it is always positive.
So one final question. Can you please go to slide number 31, sir?
Sorry, 31?
31, sir.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, just, yeah. So here in the first law, you have obviously a non-zero kappa over right here. So if your temperature is non-zero, but in the proof of the second law, you have implicitly assumed that your null generators are affinely parameterized. So your non-affinity parameter is zero. I mean, does the proof change if we choose a non-zero? I mean, non-zero. I mean, a non-affine parameter that kappa is.
No. Again, in the proof, this was for I use a degree freedom that I have is to renormalize the null generator to have kappa prime, I should say, equal to zero. So even if you start from a kappa non-zero, sub-extremal Kerr black hole, A strictly lower than M, then kappa is not zero, then I am allowed to rescale the null generator so that I get a non-affinity parameter which is zero, because this simplifies the null ratio Dury equation. So I'm always, this is the degree of freedom that I have to rescale the null normal. So so this is there is no problem with this. Maybe I didn't understand the question exactly.
So the question is on the null Raychaudhuri equation. For example, if we choose a non-zero kappa, then on the right-hand side, you have a minus of kappa theta term, right?
Yes, exactly, yes. So this is slightly more complicated. This is why, yes, if you choose non-geodesic vector, but on a pre-geodesic vector, you will end up with a term with kappa theta, yes.
So
on the right-hand side, you're right.
Second law follows through even if we have a non-zero kappa.
Yes. Okay. The conclusion will be the same. Simply the computation will be slightly more complicated because of its extra term. So, but since you have a freedom to choose L so that this extra term disappear, why not do so? I mean, it simplifies really the computation. So this is why I chose it here. But you're right. In full generality, we should have another term with kappa appearing, but we can. It's better to use theta so that because if I rescale L, I will simply rescale theta, and for all this argument about the positivity of theta, the rescaling plays no role. I mean, because I have to rescale by a positive factor anyway. So it's good to perform a rescaling from the beginning so that kappa is zero.
Thank you, sir.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box, so we may not be able to take all the questions. So there is one question by Sajat Ahmed Bhatt, which asking how to relate this kappa to other kappa which appear in the spin-induced quadrupole. I mean,
spin-induced quadrupole?
Yeah, I don't know what exactly. So,
well, we may define a quadrupole for the Kerr black hole, which is it can be expressed in terms of A and M, because in the Kerr solution, you have only two parameters, A and M. So every multiple moment of the Kerr solution that you may define by considering the behavior of a metric at infinity. Every multiple moment has to be a function of A and M. So yes, you can express the quadrupole moment in terms of A and M. But then I don't see, I don't understand the question with respect to kappa then. Sorry. Can the person ask?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so I think, so if we express the spin-induced quadrupole moment in terms of mass and spin, so there appears that kappa factor. So which we can express in, I mean, spin by mass square, J by M square. So so we can actually formulate a binary black hole test nature based on that kappa. So I just want to say, because this kappa is also related to this spin and mass, I mean this A and M, which is the specific angular momentum mass. So I just wanted to ask if we can relate this kappa to that kappa, and is it possible to formulate a, I mean, binary black hole nature test based on this kappa also?
Sorry, I don't know the formula you're talking about, so I'm not capable to answer to your question. I should have a look at that formula. I don't know. Sorry, I cannot answer.
So Eric, this is along the lines of tidal deformations. So like tidal deformations, there are spin-induced deformations to black holes and so on. So I think he's referring to that.
Yes, okay, but I don't have the formula in mind, and sorry, I cannot answer to this.
So there is another question by Orindrila Ganguly. It says, while discussing the binary black hole merger, the energy radiated by the gravitational wave is coming from the difference in mass before and after the merger.
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, does not difference in orbital kinetic energy contribute to energy carried away by the gravitational wave? So whether the orbital kinetic energy contribute to the energy carried away by the gravitational wave?
Yes, the point here is that to define this M1 and M2, we take very far apart Kerr black hole. Okay, it means that the orbital energy was very small, because otherwise we could not define M1 and M2. So during the evolution, so the initial energy, when they are very far apart, is indeed M1 plus M2. Of course, if you take a binary black hole on the very close to the merger, I mean, in the evolution, then this will be the two. You're right. There is an important part of energy which is in the orbital kinetic energy. But this is not true when they are very far apart.
So I think there is this is the last question we are going to take, which is asking that, could you please explain how you are defining the surface area of a black hole? Again. Okay,
so this we did yesterday. Maybe I can put the slide of yesterday lecture. Where is it? No, it was not yesterday, it was on Monday. Here. Yes, it was. Do you see this slide? It's taken from the first lecture. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So during this first lecture on Monday, we saw that the area of the cross-section of the non-expanding horizon and the event horizon of the black hole in equilibrium, like the Kerr black hole, is a special case of this non-expanding horizon. Well, then we saw that the area, which is defined by taking this standard formula defining the area, I mean, we take the induced metric. So here we have the area element, the square root of a determinant, and we take the integral, which defines the area, because this is a positive definite metric. So this area turns out to be independent of the choice of a cross-section. Basically, because when we transform one cross-section to the other by propagating along L, since it's non-expanding, we have a zero expansion, so the area remains constant. This is why we can speak about the area of the horizon itself, because it does not depend on the precise choice of the cross-section. So this is how the area of a black hole is defined. So in practice, for the Kerr case, we can choose for simplicity a cross-section which is a t equal constant, where t is a Kerr coordinate, for instance. And in that case, we can compute explicitly, given the Kerr metric, then we know the induced metric Q very easily. So this is an integral on theta phi simply in the case, and we can compute explicitly. And this is how we get this formula, which is A is equal to 8 pi m times m plus square root of m square minus a square. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, so I got the message that it is okay. So, okay, I think this is where we should end. So we thank Eric for this wonderful lectures. So I'm handing over to Chandra.
Thank you. So I want just to say, to conclude, that if somebody wants to ask questions, they can send me an email. If you go to the web page, you can get my email address, and I can also answer further questions by email if you have any question on this lecture. Thank you for your attention.